everyone. Good afternoon. Good evening, wherever you are in the world today. Welcome. As you're joining, please go ahead in the chat. Let us know where you're from. Where are you dialing in from? Let's see. Here we go. And in the chat, let us know where you're from. Where are you dialing in from?
It's recording.
Hey. Awesome. Welcome, everyone. Here we go. Wow, Singapore, New Zealand, UK, Texas, Missouri. Wow, it's coming up so fast, I can't read this. Richmond, South Carolina, Peru, LA, Kenya, Massachusetts, Vienna, Gruscott, Northridge, woohoo, one of my students, Mexico, Taiwan, Elk Grove, California, Cambridge, wow, Malta, Mexico, Brazil, China. Wow, the world is here. Taiwan, Miami, Kenya again, Yucatan, Mission Viejo, Maine, Northridge again, woohoo, one of mine. Sorry, got to cheer my students on. Spain, Washington, China,
Argentina, Slovenia, Netherlands.
God, the world is here today, folks. This is so exciting. Welcome. Harlene and I are just thrilled to have you here and share in the release of our latest edited work. Just so you know, this is being recorded. It will be available again online. It is being transcribed for possible publication in the Journal of Systemic Therapies. And it is being translated in live. So if you prefer to listen to this in Spanish, you can, or Chinese, Mandarin Chinese, if you can navigate to the little globe in the bottom right, on the bottom toolbar of your Zoom, there's a globe there and you click on that. And if you click on Spanish, you will hear a live simultaneous Spanish translation. If you click on Chinese, you will hear a live Mandarin translation of this webinar. So we are just thrilled to have you all here. And as you, as we go through today, if you have questions, you can put them in the chat. And we are going to be answering questions at the end of the webinar. We'll be answering them all together at one time. Very exciting. And if I forgot to mention this, we are also streaming live on YouTube. So yeah, we got the whole world here. This is so exciting. And we're going to go ahead. Hopefully everyone's been able to log in, get to their right channel. Those of you who want to earn CEs, there is a way to do that. You can check in the chat. There is a link there. There's a nominal fee. You will be able to get your CE certificate after the second half of this, which is next Saturday. Again, we're doing this same time, same Zoom link. And once it's all done, if you sign up for that, you'll get an email which will give you instructions on how to get those CEs, continuing education. It is sponsored by the NBCC, National Board of Certified Counselors, and there will also be CEUs for the California Association for Marriage and Family Therapy. Sorry, no CEs for psychologists, but hey. Okay, I think we're good to go. So welcome everyone. And so Harlene, thank you for being here and for hosting. And I would love if you could start us off by just telling everyone how this book came to be.
And thank you, Diane, for everything that you have done, particularly technologically, to make the book and this happen today and next Saturday. So yes, people are wondering how the book came about. Well, one day, and this was in 2019, I opened my email and there was an invitation by Routledge, or an inquiry. Would I be interested in doing a revised or second edition of Collaborative Therapy, the first book that Diane and I edited together? And my first thought was, this is not a decision that I make. This is something I would discuss with Diane and that we would make together. So Diane and I talked, and I told her, I said, I am not interested in doing a revised or second edition because I've been thinking about another book, and that other book has to do with the application of the conceptual framework or the ideas and the practice in other contexts and disciplines and settings. So then, as it turns out, in continued communication with the editor at Routledge, who was in London, she said she would be at AAMFT meeting, American Association of Marriage and Family Therapy, in Texas. And so Diane was going to be there, and I said, well, I can be there. So the three of us met, and she told us what Routledge wanted. And I told her what I had been thinking and what Diane and I had discussed and what we were proposing. Well, she was not too warm or welcoming of the idea at first, because she wanted to make sure that there was some continuity in terms of the cover, in terms of the title. And so then I said, well, I've been thinking about this for a long time, and this book will be a political statement. And the political statement has to do with something that Harry Galishan, my colleague that I worked with for many decades, and I had been talking about since at least the very early 80s. And that was an irreverent attitude toward marriage and family therapy. And our idea was that marriage and family therapy was becoming internally insulated and externally isolated, that it was enfolding on itself and producing more and more of the same, and that as our contemporary world was changing, that our ideas and our practice needed to change to keep up with what was happening in the world. Most importantly for me over the years has been that people everywhere demand to have a voice or input into decisions and policies that affect their lives. That's not for an expert, whether that's a therapist or a politician or a teacher or a principal or someone else to decide, particularly someone in a so-called expert or hierarchical or authoritarian position from their perspective. So as we began talking, and Diane was on board with this idea, the editor at Routledge got enthused. So then I told Diane, I said, well, as I've been traveling around the world, I meet people who are doing such interesting work that I'm going to call upon these people. And it will be a challenge because some of them do fabulous work, but they do not write, they've not published, they do not share their work either in writing or in workshops. So it will be a challenge to pull all of this together in a book. So then I began contacting various people. Some of you will be with us today, some of you next week, next Saturday. And some of you, of course, and some of the authors are quite well published. Probably the most well-known among us on the screen right now is Susan McDaniel, who I met many decades ago in Houston, Texas, when she came to do her psychology residency in Houston, Texas, and Harry Galishan and I met her. Dan Wolfe and Sally are very well published, as Diane Gehart, Saliha Bava, and if I'm missing someone else, I apologize.
Marcia's on today.
Okay, so someone new was Marcia, and I invited Marcia because we were having a conversation one day, and she told me how she had been thinking about a butterfly has taken my thought away. I'm sorry.
It's okay. The translators are wanting us to slow down anyway, so.
I think we were both talking much too quickly. We'll slow down. So anyway, a Pulitzer Prize, not Pulitzer Prize, also Pulitzer Prize, but also most importantly, a help me, Diane. And
Toni
yeah,
Morrison.
that's right, the Nobel Prize. How could I forget that? Yeah, the Nobel Prize winner. And Marcia had been comparing her acceptance speech for the prize and collaborative-dialogic practices, and decided that there were some connections and similarities. And the more she talked, well, could you write about this? Well, no, I really don't write, she responded. And I said, please. And so then I talked with Diane, and we thought this would be an excellent chapter for the book. So it just happened this way. Other people I've met and worked with over the years, like Richard de la Guarda, Sylvia London, my dear colleagues in Merida, Papusa, and Rocio, and other people around the world who are contributing. So that's how it started, and it's taken a while with the pandemic. Sometimes people were occupied by other things and slow to respond. And Rutledge was in a process of doing some kind of reorganization, and we ended up having a new editor and a new technical person there we were working with. So the book has had a long history in terms of the production, which is not that unusual. But we are delighted that each and every one of you are joining us today. And I thought that what I would do to kind of help continue to set the tone for the book is to share some highlights of the conceptual framework, one of the chapters that I contributed, and what I call the framework or the philosophy of the practice in action, the practice chapter that I contributed. So with the conceptual framework, it's very much influenced by what I call ideas that come under a postmodern umbrella that have some threads running through them that are similar to ideas in various versions of postmodernism. And one of those is social construction, various philosophies of dialogue, of language. So the conceptual framework pulls briefly from those areas and focuses mainly on the notions of knowledge, the notions of language, and the relationship of those to what is often called dialogue. And people often say, well, Harlene, why do you use such a word like dialogue? I say, well, because I personally prefer conversation, because I think conversation is more like everyday ordinary talk. And that's what gets people's attention. They think, oh, so you're talking about chit chat. I say, no, I'm not talking about chit chat. I'm talking about how people interact with each other in relationships and in conversations in ways in which they use language, their own language. They are creating knowledge. They are creating ideas about what the struggles or the challenges in their life are, and ways in which to address those. So a lot of transformation or creativity or innovation in terms of how people can continue to live their lives and address the things that we all face can happen. I think particularly from the conceptual framework, the thing that I often stress is to think that working from a collaborative dialogic, which is a mouthful in itself, practice perspective requires an epistemological shift, and it requires a mindset shift. And by mindset shift, I mean it requires a shift in how we think about the world, ourselves in the world, the people that we work with, and how we position ourselves with each other and interact with each other. I think the mindset shift also invites us to be a critical and informed consumer of knowledge, and to respect the expertise that a client, whether that's a student in a classroom, a client in a therapy session, a politician in a consultation, whomever it may be, that they have more expertise than we could ever have on their lives and their context, and how to be curious and interested in that and honor that, and that's the meet the core of the resources that we have available. And then I think thirdly is to be very aware of the risk and the pitfalls of what can be thought of as generalized knowledge. Knowledge that we've inherited in our everyday lives from our cultural disciplines, activities, discourses, cultural discourses, I should say. And that when we generalize, generalizations tend to mask the unique complexities of any one person or any one group's life. Again, whether that's an educational life, a political life, a cultural neighborhood, community
And
life,
Harlene,
or family.
just going to remind you to pause a little bit. The translators are working real hard to keep up with you.
Okay, I apologize to the translators. Okay, so then I'll pause there on kind of summarizing the highlights of the conceptual framework and say that for me, the conceptual framework informs an orientation, informs our actions, or the way that we perform the conceptual framework. It informs alternative ways to look, listen, and learn. And I think that the conceptual framework also provides a way in which we can have freedom to uniquely interact and respond in ways that are congruent with the people we work with and the occasions or situations that they present in their everyday lives or their everyday work. So then I began to think, okay, so what I'm really talking about is a philosophy of life, a philosophy of practice. And for me, it's important for us to be congruent in all aspects of our lives. Now, that doesn't mean that if we're working with a group of teachers or a classroom of students, or with a family in a therapy room, or a group of board members in an organization, that we are not responding uniquely to their situation. But we're not performing a role that's been prescribed by our or their professional or particular discourse. But that we are allowed to be flexible, and I think most importantly, to be spontaneous and natural. And I think that's very important. And that's some of the feedback that I hear from therapists, particularly therapists who are interested in practicing and trying to work from a collaborative dialogic perspective, is that they don't have to try to emulate or duplicate another person's personality or way of working, but they can use their own personality, their own assets, their own history as a resource and in a natural and spontaneous way. Now, back to the word postmodern, how it came to mind from what I was just saying, is that often people think that from a postmodern perspective or a collaborative dialogic perspective, anything goes. You can do or you can say anything. Any reality is the reality. Well, no, not exactly. We make those distinctions. We make those distinctions with the people that we work with, the people we interact with daily. As Tom Anderson, the Norwegian psychiatrist who was one of the members of the original reflecting team idea, said, we participate in creating the people sitting in front of us by the way that we are seeing and hearing them, how we're filtering them through our professional expert interpretations, and they respond to that person that we are being when we are being that way. And therefore they are confirming our ideas about them. So I'll shift to then for collaborative dialogic practitioners, what is important. I think what is important is being interested in how to do it and how to do it in a natural and spontaneous way that fits with another person. and that our knowledge about how to do it is learned in the doing of it. And therefore, it is ever emerging and allows us to continually shift and be flexible and sometimes bend ourselves like a pretzel to fit with the particular person and the occasion of his or her or their life. So that knowledge is not something that is static or repeatable, but it's something that's always emerging. It's always in the process of being created. And that leads to the idea that Donald Schoen wrote about, John Schotter wrote about, and a organization consultant in New Mexico named Ann Cunliffe, that some of you have met or maybe read some of her writing. Or they talk about what I call a reflexive practitioner, that we take time, we take the luxury to step back, as Haibo Zing might say, and carefully think about, consider our work, our experiences of the last hour, experiences of the day, the week, the month, the year, etc. And what can we learn from those experiences, and how can they inform the next step we take? So it's like each of our experiences is like putting our foot on quicksand, or what we might think is quicksand. Is it firm? Do we feel secure? Can we move ahead? Or shall we step back and experiment with or practice taking a step in a different direction? So that's all I'm going to say right now, Diane. Maybe you want to say a little bit about your contributions to the book and the organization of the book.
Absolutely.
Practice book.
Absolutely. And then in about what we are going to do, I'm going to talk a little, well, the book is organized in two parts, and I'm also, and it kind of is paralleling how we're organized today. And we're going to start bringing on the chapter contributors, the chapter authors, in about 5 minutes. And just so everyone knows, we'll be spending about 15 minutes with each of the chapters. So you kind of get a grand tour of the book. And the first half of the book is kind of looking at some of the philosophical foundations. Harlene, I love your first two chapters. I think it is your best expression of the work. And I will be certainly assigning that to a lot of my students. But then, we hear from many different voices just in terms of kind of how to just using this work in different ways. We're going to hear in a moment from Saliha Bava, who is using it, looking at the political aspect of collaborative dialogue, and really, I think, taking on and addressing social justice and diversity issues in such an important way. I am so excited about that. I talk a little bit about using about my collaborative dialogue and curiosity as a mindfulness practice. We'll hear from Marcia also, as you mentioned. And then in the second half of the book, we get a grand world tour of how these ideas are being used around the world in various different contexts: medicine, education, business, research, everyday life, climate change activism, using ancestral knowledge. It is just really a very rich tour, an international tour of how these ideas have been used around the world and in different disciplines. So I think there's just a lot there for everyone. And I think it really gives us a lot to reflect on, especially during these challenging times that we're in, how to meet life's challenges with grace and compassion. And if the one thing I think about this work is that it really, the best word I can think of, these are humanizing conversations. These are how to interact with others that call forth the humanity of each person. It is it is transformative, and I don't think the world can get enough of these conversations at this point in history. And I'm just thrilled that everyone who is here is joining us and learning along with us. And we have so many experts around the world, and I am so thankful for them to be sharing their work both in the book and their time with us this Saturday and next Saturday.
So Diane, thank you for saying learning with us, because we have been learning with all of these authors. And I'm wondering, in terms of the 2-minute abstracts from each author that's here today, should we start with those authors who are here who contributed to the first section?
Well, yeah, we'll be going through, and Harlene, would you like to do your 2-minute abstract now?
Well, I think I just did
That,
it.
that was yours. You did more than 2 minutes, but that's okay.
Yeah.
It's all good. No. So you're good. No, as we bring them on, each one will get their 2-minute, do their little abstract summary for everyone. And then we will be having a dialogue with each of the chapter authors and just about their work and what's in there. So everyone who is joining us can learn a little bit, about the wisdom and the insights and the humanity from each of these different authors who just are doing incredible work. So, okay. Well, Harlene, I think we've come to a nice pausing point, and I'm actually thinking of getting a little ahead in the schedule and bringing on Saliha Bava and going and getting started. So, Saliha, I'm going to ask you to, welcome. We're going to go ahead and ask you to just start by sharing with us a summary of your article for those who are listening. And we are going to go ahead and spotlight you for everybody. And yeah, audio's good. And those of you who are watching, you can actually control. I have forced upon you spotlighting our very own Saliha Bava, but you can control your view in the upper right corner to view us any way that makes you happy. But we'll go ahead, Saliha, and give you the floor.
Well, thank you. Thank you first to Diane and Harlene for inviting me to write this chapter. And the invitation was, tell us what you want to tell us. And so here is my abstract of the chapter, and then I look forward to the conversation with you both. My chapter title is A Relationally Responsive World, the Politics of Collaborative-Dialogic Practice. Collaborative-dialogic practice originates from the critique of grand narratives, shedding light on our knowledge-making practices, and with the invitation to understand how language is a social process. That's what makes it political. And yet, I think these practices have been critiqued for not being critical enough. And this, in my opinion, is because of a narrow view of power analysis, which has been limited to structural power analysis. Now, mind you, structural power analysis is very important, but how we do power analysis, that's also important. And collaborative dialogic practice is a political activity because it engages in such inquiry about all constructs, including power analysis. And that is what I explore in this chapter. To illustrate how the much needed structural power analysis that we do is inadequate without a discursive power analysis. So what is discursive? Discursive, I think, underpins what collaborative dialogic is, because it's the interplay of our interactions, language, and making meaning. And discursive power is the power of withness. I borrow this from Schroeder. It is about what we do together. So while structural power analysis is top-down power analysis, discursive power analysis power with. And both are crucial for social change. I assert in the chapter that without noticing what people do together and what they're doing makes is a way to keep alive the pathways of supremacy and elitism. That's a bold statement, and I stand by it. And these are words that I also build on from Sheila McNamee. But it is the pathway by which I enter into what I'm talking about, which is relational responsiveness, another concept taken from and built on by John Schroeder. I say it is in our responsiveness, in our conversations, in our dialogues, that we see the power of what we do together. Relational responsiveness is engagement. Relational responsiveness is what we need to engage to create social change, because it requires us to see how local knowledge, language, and our participation, our collective participation, are deeply intertwined in this discursive process of creating that which we analyze as structural and social processes, which in turn shape our lived realities. So in closing, I want to leave you with this visual image, if I may, of what I'm talking about, because I found it really hard to keep alive this interplay between our interactions and the social systems which interact and come alive through our meanings, the local meanings that we make together. So I call this the relational discursive loop, and invite you and leave you with this invitation to read more about this and much more in my chapter. Thank you. And be in dialogue, be in conversation.
Thank you, Saliha.
Thank you. Thank you. I am aware that we are having some issues with our Spanish translation channel. For some reason, the translator stopped getting sound. Is that what's going on? So if you're, I guess if you're listening, I don't know if you have to come back to the original sound. At least you'll get it in English until we can figure out what's going on with the Spanish channel. But maybe our interpreter can log back out and log back in, and we'll get her set up. So I apologize for those of you listening to the Spanish, but we're working on getting that fixed. So yeah, she's logging out. She's going to come back in, so that, yeah, it'll disappear for a moment, but we will be back hopefully with Spanish in just a moment. Okay.
So, Diane, I found Saliha's words in her chapter and in her brief abstract just now profoundly beautiful and profoundly challenging. Particularly, I'm connecting it to my thoughts about how we can stay in step with our contemporary world. And then the whole notice of witness, whether you're talking about in conversations and relationships, whatever the topic might be, ethics, politics, war.
Absolutely. And I think for me, what I found, Saliha, what I loved so much about your chapter, and I do think it is such an important work at this time in history, is that you introduce back in, or you emphasize and you highlight into the current dialogue or discourse around, diversity and social justice, this concept of power with, because so much of the dialogue right now is focused on power over who's got power, who's abusing power, who's misusing power. And it's like, we talk a lot about social justice in only the hierarchical way of using power. And this is, like you said, we need to look at that to deconstruct it, understand what's going on, highlight it, better understand processes like, systemic racism. But then there's no healthy alternative. It's almost like we stay in this power dynamic, and that's the first step, is to kind of deconstructing the problem. But how do we move forward? And I think your work is so really precious is the word that comes to mind for me, because there aren't a lot of models about how to move forward in a more well, collaborative, respectful way that really, calls forth the humanity of each person. That's my word I keep going back to. And I would love for you to say more about that.
Yeah, I think you both are talking about something very important. And when we think about it, we have collapsed power analysis and critical as one thing. And we need room, we need to breathe, right? As Harlene was talking earlier, these are constructs, these are processes we make together. So the meaning of what is critical, the meaning of power, the meaning of power analysis, the process of doing that, all are socially constructed, right? So one way, and I don't want to be reductionistic, but for the sake of this conversation right now, one way to think about structural power analysis is it is about historical, what has been happening, how the process have gotten sedimented and institutionalized, and how they kind of become puppet masters, and we are dancing to those tunes, and our lives are in their hands, right? What it doesn't show is what's in our hands.
Yes.
It doesn't show our resistance. It doesn't show those of us as I'm a brown woman from India. What does that mean? What's the meaning of brown woman? I think we may be having some translation issues.
And she is now back on her channel.
Okay.
Spanish
great.
is on. We heard her sound. So Carla's got sound. Thank you, Carla, for doing the translation. It sounds like she's got sound, and you can hop back on that Spanish channel.
Excellent. I'm sorry for those who missed it, but hopefully we'll have a way my video gets translated in Spanish later. We can get to that. So what I'm really proposing in this moment is that how we understand what is critical, how we understand what is political is really important. And the way I'm talking about political is what we do together. And the power of togetherness is what is we're talking as discursive power, or the power with the other. And in that moment, it becomes the power of construction, the power of responsiveness, the power of how do we go on from this place that has created such a divisive power differential between people, groups of people. How do we, and if we look at it, structural and systemic and social power that we analyze comes out of what people do together. So take the process of making a constitution. It doesn't get written by itself.
Yeah.
It gets institutionalized as a written text, but it is what we would say, at least in the US, we use the term, the founders. The founders wrote it together, but they had meetings and conversations. And it is still through the judicial system, through our political system, and through people's participation, it's still a text that gets interpreted as how to create our materialized lives, how to live into those ideas. So the discursive, and by discursive, again, it's the interplay of interpretation, language, meaning, and the interactions that happen. That's what I mean by the discursive. It's always in play with the structural power analysis. So I'm saying one without the other will not succeed in creating the change.
And it's a beautiful segue, Saliha, into Marcia's chapter, where she talks about Toni Morrison, the Nobel Prize laureate, who says this lovely thing we do together.
Yes. And I think I do tap and point to her chapter for this reason, because I think we need to have ways of imagining. We need alternate stories. We need alternate visions, if you may, of how do we make, for lack of a better word, this thing that we do together, how do we make it more visible? Right? And her stories does that beautifully through the literary story within a story is what I call her chapter. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the other thing I love about your chapter and your model is how you connect, and maybe you put up your slide one more time.
Sure.
She connects how every utterance, every word we speak is shaping, the meaning we're making in this moment, which shapes relationships, which goes and shapes the institutions, the societal discourses. So from each utterance connects to our frame stories and meanings, right? And those connect to the largest level of our societal systems, the dominant discourses we talk about, and that all of these are constantly in play and changing and shifting. And I think it is a model, like you're saying, because you're connecting, the discursive with those broader power structures, and to see how we are all part of the meanings that we create and the societal discourses that we're a part of.
Right, right. And I think thank you for highlighting that, Dan, because often even you're framing it as a model for social justice. And I'm saying this is life.
Yes.
Justice is part of life, right?
Yes.
And absolutely, we are fighting for justice. And 30 years of my career, that's what I've done. I grew up in India. I worked in what would be considered the tribal belts for land rights, women's rights. So for me, I have not done justice work.
Yeah.
But for me, to have a fair and equitable and access-oriented life is what a good life is.
Yeah.
So justice can become what Audre Lorde is, we're not living single issue lives. I'm paraphrasing. So justice can become, again, an othered context. Oh, Saliha is working in the context of social justice.
Yeah.
No, I am saying any action, everyday interactions have the potential, the possibility to shape our social, systemic, structural processes and get sedimented as institutions. And here, I call it as a resource, like Marsha's story. I think we need visuals. We need different ways to imagine. So again, I want to be careful of the word model, but thank you for calling that, because you elevate it, giving me more power. But it's a knowledge-making practice, right? So I think about it as a resource because you can combine this with other practices by which to be present, that when we are engaged in whatever activity we are engaged, to notice how might these spaces are playing out. How are we calling forth the social? How are we noticing that what we're saying, our interpretations and our utterances are closely shaped and are shaping those meanings, the social meanings, the social discourses that we're drawing upon, which are underpinned and shaping the social and systemic. So that is that interplay that I'm inviting people to notice, even if I'm just doing a call with a client, or I'm talking to my child, or I'm a teacher or a researcher. How are these different spaces in interplay in that moment? So that's the invitation.
I love that. I love that. And we are going to also just pause for the translators to catch up.
Sorry.
No, it's okay. We all get excited and we all talk fast. And when we're in person, it's easier to remember that there are translators. And it's a little more, when it's behind the scenes on Zoom, it is harder to remember.
Right. Yeah, you're right.
Well, at this point, we're going to actually switch over, strangely enough, to my chapter. And,
thank you again for having me. And for the
Saliha, don't leave. I just thought if you want, you can hang on and join with Harlene and talk to me about mine. How does that sound? Since Harlene loses her partner to her dialogic partner in interviewing me. So I'm going to go ahead and I guess just take a moment here, and I'm going to do my little brief abstract. I will go ahead and spotlight. Here we go. So yeah, but thank you again, Saliha. Okay, so my chapter is Curiosity as a Mindfulness Practice. following the moment-to-moment unfolding of meaning construction in collaborative dialogic practice. And the idea for this chapter came about, well, obviously, as one of the editors, I needed to write about something. And I work primarily as a professor teaching master's level marriage family therapists how to do this work. And so I've spent a lot of time just trying to get people to learn how to work in a collaborative way. And we talk a lot about curiosity and not knowing, and my students are often very confused. And I realize that oftentimes the idea of curiosity is somewhat misunderstood in that it's not curiosity about just anything, and it's not curiosity, just randomly, that there really is. And I would actually use the term, I don't know if Harlene's going to agree with this, it's almost like a discipline, but there's this focus where I am focusing how the client is making meaning. And I'm curious specifically about how the client made the meanings that they're experiencing related to whatever they're talking about. Usually it's a problem, but it could be anything. And that when I'm sitting there as a therapist in dialogue with my client, I am 100% focused on following this trail. This breadcrumb trail is sometimes how I teach it, of meaning. And I realized that this has many, many similarities to actual mindfulness practice. I also actually came to this work. I studied Buddhism before I studied psychotherapy. And so I came to this work very aware of the concept of mindfulness being totally in the present moment. And normally we're following our breath, but when you're doing this work, there's very much a similarity to following the unfolding of meaning that I liken to mindfulness meditation practice. And I always say, when you're doing this work, your mind doesn't have the luxury, it doesn't have time to wander, because it takes all of my brain power. Even after 30 years with each client, they have 100% of my attention. I'm never on autopilot when I do my work, because every person, every session, every word is unique meaning being constructed in the present moment, right there between the two of us. And that is what I stay focused on. So yeah, in my chapter, I make some parallels then between the focus in the present moment of what's unfolding in mindfulness practice is very similar, I believe, to how we do this collaborative dialogic work. That was what my chapter was about. Harlene or
I like
Saliha?
the emphasis on focus, because it is a focus. It's a self-discipline, which is informed, I think, by the mindset shift. That the most important person in the room is the person or persons you're interacting with, and how can you be focused on them, attentive, as you say, 100% to everything that they're saying or doing, and realize that this is all you have. You can't fill in the blanks of their history or your experiences, but you have to take from what they are saying, and you have to continually be in the process, as you were saying, of trying to understand it, trying to walk alongside them.
Yes, I was pulling up a page that I remember loving it. So I'm dangling it as a little bit of a teaser for people to come back and read, but I think it really captures something very powerful. You're helping us unpack and understand collaborative dialogic curiosity in terms of intentional focus, moment by moment awareness, and non-judgmental observation. All easily said than done.
Like mindfulness.
Yes, right. But it is that invitation of intentionality along with the presence of this moment, both to self and other, and what we're creating together in the moment. right? And so I love this expansion that you bring to mindfulness, coming from culture where mindfulness is drawn from in India and it's tied to yoga. You're talking about mindfulness as presence to what we are
Yes.
co-creating together. So I love that.
Well, thank you. And there is a presence that is very different when a practitioner, whether they're a therapist, an educator, even a business partner, listens in this way. And it's very noticeable. I will often have people who call me, for an appointment. And they often say, in the 5 minutes I spoke to you, I feel more understood than the last therapist I saw for 2 years. And there is something different, and it's in the quality of the presence. And that's what I try to capture in this chapter.
How do you practice that, Diane, to that presence? I mean, I think there's intentionality, but I'm curious if you can share, given your tradition, how do you practice it? How do you stay present?
How do I stay in the moment in a therapy session? How do I practice it?
Yes.
It's funny. From the very beginning, when I first learned this work, the word I used is I step into the vortex. And I step into this time and space where, you're never totally disconnected from your internal dialogue, but it is this 100% being focused in the moment. And it is this abundance of curiosity of how the client makes meaning. The other metaphor I've started using recently, which is kind of a surprising one, and it probably needs I'm going to have to gloss it culturally, is I use the metaphor of the holodeck. And the holodeck, for those who are old enough to and have access to Star Trek movies from about 20, 30 years ago, there was this deck on a starship in the Star Trek series that was a 3-dimensional world that the user got to program, and they could create, a garden scene, they could recreate a historical scene, they could make up something that's never existed, but the user programs everything. And so the metaphor I use is doing this work is like stepping into someone else's holodeck. They have programmed their world, and you're totally blindfolded. And you have to grab onto their arm, and they're going to give you a tour of their world. And you just don't know, clouds can be on the ground, rivers can flow through the air, lions, they can say lion, but it could be a vegetarian grazing animal here, and the gazelles can be apex predators. You just don't know till you ask, and you're totally blindfolded, and you're dependent on them to reveal the logic of this world. And to this day, you can meet with the same client for years. Every time I sit down, I know I'm blindfolded. They're going to give me a tour because we don't know what meanings, going back to your little diagram there, we don't know what utterances, conversations, and meanings got made this week in their world that shifted their holodeck this week. And I make no assumptions even from week to week. And so I get they give me the tour of their world. But I also know when I ask those questions, I am making them aware of these connections that they weren't aware of before. And they were like, oh, so lions aren't grazers in your world? Oh, I had no idea. They always graze here, And so and it's always this total adventure. But it is always been like I enter this other, I used to call it the vortex, because I forget about all my problems because I don't have time to think about my world. It's kind of nice, especially when your life is stressful. But I enter their world, and it's always this beautiful adventure that we go on, and we make meaning. And what happens is, as I ask them questions about how their holodeck works, they begin to realize how their holodeck works and they understand how their holodeck works in a totally new way. And they'll oftentimes, meaning sometimes just almost collapse because they're realizing, oh yeah, that doesn't make that yet. Oh yeah, that doesn't make sense, does it? Or they just see their world differently. So that, I don't know, Saliha, if that answers your question.
I think more than, because the chat window is buzzing with the love for this metaphor. So I think you hit it out of the ballpark, as they say. Harlene, what are you thinking?
Well, I'm thinking that it just so highlights the idea that the client is the expert on their lives, and that you have to really listen to the narratives, the stories they want to tell you about their life in the way that they want to tell you. You cannot have an idea about what they should be saying, how they should be saying it, what's important kind of data or facts to gather. You have to let go of all of that. So I keep going back to this notion of a mindset shift.
Sorry, your voice failed, Harlene. Go
Going
back.
back to the notion of a mindset shift. So when you say, how do you practice it? I think you have to start with letting go of some things and begin to develop different kinds of values or beliefs for oneself.
Can I just unpack that a little bit with you, Dan, as well? Because the word mind often gets synonym with brain. And yet we're talking, as we're talking here, as the social mind, right? The mind that gets cultivated through these interactions, the way you're talking. So can you say a little bit more about how you speak about mindset or mindfulness and the word mind? Because it's loaded with so much.
Yes, it is loaded.
Not thinking about it is something that you can touch or diagram or draw a picture of. But it's really the way that you think about things, which is influenced by so much of our historical experiences in life, as well as the current experiences that begin to inform our values and our beliefs, and how to be able to step back and question those things that we hold so dear, to be able to make a little bit of room, something else new and different to come in. And we have to be able to do that ourselves, and to be open to other people doing it with us, questioning us, challenging us, and not getting defensive of what we hold so dear. But what anyone questions or challenges or says is a possibility of something to talk about, something to consider.
Yeah.
So that's why I say a mindset shift. I really don't think there's any such thing as a mind, inside one's heads or whatever, but I hope that helps.
And maybe I'll use a recent example. I was, and I'm going to try to talk slower for the interpreters. I get excited. I'm Greek, so fast talking is part of what we do. But I was doing a demonstration with a student recently, talking about an issue he was struggling with, and kind of demonstrating this principle. And I had, asked about how he arrived at a particular meaning. It was a variation of feeling judged, which often all of us have that thought. And what happened was I kind of asked about things that were going on in the present that may have helped him arrive at this idea of being judged. And I didn't find anything. And so then I started asking about more historical places where this could have come from. And he went immediately back to some traumatic experiences in youth. And the folks who were watching afterwards, they said, it looks so psychodynamic, and there are other parts that are like, you look so solution focused. And I said, well, they said, what are you doing? How do you know to go to the past? And I said, well, when I'm touring the holodeck and he's got this interpretation that I can't follow the meaning, how he got there based on what he just said, then I ask, where do you think you got this interpretation? Because you're saying there's nothing in the current situation. And that's where he went, boom, right back to a traumatic memory in his childhood. And so we ended up there. And so I followed the meaning back there. And then there was another point in the conversation, he was worrying a lot. And so I was looking for evidence for, and against. And so they said that looked very solution focused, but I'm still doing it from within his meaning making, at his pace of making meaning, and following that. But where it doesn't make sense to me is, where I'll pause and ask. And that is often why it can sometimes look like, other approaches when people are watching. But it's still following that breadcrumb trail of meaning. So, well, I'm going to pause there because at this point I am done with my time. But thank you all for helping me unpack this chapter.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, thank you. And thank you, Saliha, for doing that on the fly. Love it.
Sure, loved it. Thank you. Beautiful conversation.
Marcia, if you could please join us. Oh, no. Oh,
Well, am I there? No?
you
There
are
I
here
am.
now.
Okay.
Lovely. It is
Hello,
lovely
everybody.
to have us.
So glad to be here. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, thank you. And we would love to give you your 2 minutes to just update our audience on your chapter and what it's all about.
Well, thank you. Chapter 5 is entitled This Lovely Thing We Do Together, Collaborative-Dialogic Practice Through a Literary Lens. And in this chapter, I explore collaborative dialogic practices through a piece of literature. And I compare the ideas of Harlene Anderson and Toni Morrison. And I came to this because when Toni Morrison died, I reread her Nobel Prize lecture. And I realized that Harlene Anderson and Toni Morrison, first of all, were paradigm shifters in their respective fields of family therapy and literature. And that interested me. But as I thought about it further, they actually share a philosophy. And that philosophy is that knowledge is created in relationships and conversations, forming narratives and communities and cultures. And this was very obvious in the lecture, the Toni Morrison lecture. And they also share a philosophy that language has agency, that it's an act with consequences. And then finally, they share a philosophy that relational ethics is essential for dynamic relationships and conversations. And I look at those shared philosophies through making comparisons with the ideas in the Nobel lecture and the ideas of collaborative dialogic practice, such as curiosity, not knowing, respect. And the conclusion of the chapter, the character in the story that she tells concludes with, look at this, with her conversational partner, she says, look at this lovely thing we've done together, which reminds me of our work.
Thank you. Thank you. That was beautiful.
Yeah. Thank you, Marcia, and thank you for the elevation.
Yeah, so
Beautiful.
the genesis of this chapter had to do with Harlene expressing at a meeting one time, it's interesting to compare other disciplines with our discipline. And I had read an article in the Journal of Collaborative-Dialogic Practices, the International Journal, where somebody had compared filmmaking to a collaborative practice, collaborative dialogic practices. And that was some inspiration.
Yes, I mean, your chapter is just beautiful. And for those of us who just love literature, poetry, it was just such a fun read, actually, your chapter. But it is, you know, I'd never thought of it before, how, I mean, I love poetry. When I was younger, I used to read a lot of it. I used to write a lot of it in high school during math class. That's what I did during math class, folks. But it's so rich with meaning. Like poetry is so dense. And I don't know if you want to just speak to the multifaceted meaning you typically find in like poetry and literature, and how that relates in your chapter, Marcia.
In the metaphors.
In metaphors, yes.
Yeah, I like the metaphors throughout the Nobel Prize lecture that to me clearly stood for this lovely thing we do together, much like you were talking about, Diane, and Saliha was talking about. I am not an expert on literature. It just so happens that in the late 80s, early 90s, when I was learning about collaborative dialogic practice and forming a community there, I was also forming a community of a book club. And up to that point, I only read nonfiction, as we, all did who were in graduate school. And so I got turned on to literature through a community of readers. And we've read, and we're still meeting once a month after all these years, just like my collaborative dialogical practice group has been meeting since 1999. So those two groups interact to have brought this about for me. So I wouldn't even begin to comment on poetry and literature, but I will quote Isabel Allende, who says, there's nothing truer than fiction. So I find that to be absolutely correct. We live in narratives and stories.
Mm-hmm. And one of the things in your chapter that you highlight is that human beings do language, and that very much connects also what Saliha was talking about, how down to our utterances, how we shape meaning and how we shape those grander societal discourses and how those come back and shape our meanings and our words. And I don't know if you want to link some of that to
well, I actually think this chapter addresses power, and I was really interested in how collaborative dialogic practices addresses power from the other side, similar to what Saliha was saying. And by that, I mean, we don't talk about power outright, but I find the way we work to be radically democratic, at least moving toward sort of radical democracy, in that hierarchies are flattened in the way that we work. And in this story, in this fable, the story within the story, the wise old woman who is supposed to be the expert, she becomes subjugated by the young children who have come to talk with her about their problems. They find her she's blind, she's poor, and they thought they were coming to somebody who could really answer all their questions. And she has to grapple with her internal dialogue about feeling subjugated, but still wanting to be relational, still wanting to be conversational. And as I say in the chapter, as collaborative dialogic practitioners, we try to put something into the conversation that at least gives people a sense of belonging, and at best invites further engagement. And I saw her, the way I read her dilemma, she was power overed, and she had to deal with that. And we all know that unexamined power in relationships can lead to harm.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Beautiful, beautiful.
Thank you both.
Harlene, do you want to add anything to this?
No, I just was spellbound in reading it, and just thrilled that Marcia was writing, and I've already invited her to write something else.
There are two quotes that I quote in the chapter. One is a quote in a Family Process article by Harlene, which to me really addresses social justice and power more than anything else that I'd read. And that has to do that with this idea that we live in practice surrounded by fast changing global and local landscapes that reflect social, cultural, political, and economic transformations. Concomitantly, we witness a forceful swelling plea from all corners of the world for democracy, social justice, and human rights. And that quote goes on.
Read a little slower for the translators.
Oh, okay. What did you, I went too fast?
Yeah, it's a little fast for the translators, so.
Okay. Anyway, it's a quote that we probably have all read, but I contrasted that quote with Toni Morrison's quote in her lecture about how language can destroy lives or it can create possibilities. Toni Morrison reflects on the subjugation that the young people do of the old woman and talks about how oppressive language really, it's like a warning of the effects of oppressive language.
Yeah.
So those two
Yeah.
quotes seem to be important to me to put in the chapter as to compare and contrast.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think it's just so timely for this time in history where I think people are becoming more aware of how we use our words and the effects they have.
Mhm.
And yeah, and the old woman in the story, you know, how do you respond, you know, to this type of conversation or dialogue where where there's a power over, and how do you engage that in a way that hopefully again enhances the humanity of both. That's and I think that's the beauty of this work, and the power of this work is to be able to engage and to have a framework for, I don't know, Harlene probably wouldn't call this a framework, but there's a way of thinking, a mindset, a philosophy for how to be in those moments, how to respond in those moments, to hopefully create more humanizing conversations.
Mhm. Yeah. It's interesting to me about the long pause. That's the other thing in the chapter that I'd like to point to, is that the old woman spends most of the time in the story in silence. And we all know about silence, and it can be uncomfortable. And her silence was designed for her to make sure that she knew when she spoke back into the conversation, it would be effective. But it took her a long time in her internal dialogue. And then the author, Toni Morrison, reflects on the internal dialogue of the old woman and how she's grappling with the wisdom she has from her training and her knowledge of relational processes and conversation and dialogue, and how angry she feels that they are laughing at her, and that they approached her from the beginning with a trick question, and so she's silent. The main character is silent through most of it, and then the few words that she does add to the conversation end up being very powerful and bringing her conversational partners into excitement about being there with her and being there together. And so I think that's really fascinating to think about how we pause, or maybe we don't pause enough. You know, we talk a lot about asking questions, but what happens when we slow down?
Yeah. And that is so true and so powerful. I actually have called, I've often noticed that when I'm listening to clients, and let's say I ask them a question like, where does this meaning come from? When there's, I tell my students, listen for the pause, because when your clients pause in their response, they are, to go back to the holodeck, they're realizing the connections, they're pulling together new meanings, they're realizing, oh, that's where this comes from. And in that pause is almost always, this is the client pause, not the therapist pause, but it is often where they're making new meaning and where new meaning gets created. And just like you're saying with the old woman, it's also where she's pausing to take in what they're saying, which is very different way meaning making than where she is putting them together and being thoughtful and intentional about what words I speak next are going to shape the meaning we make, the identities of everyone in this conversation. And I want to make sure it moves things in a positive direction. So that pause is so important, I think, for the client as well as for the practitioner. Because in those pauses, as you're pointing out beautifully, Marcia, and Tom Anderson always reminded us that that's internal dialogue we need to also create space for. And I'm pretty sure our translators are wishing we did more internal dialogue as we are rushing through all of this.
Yeah.
Marcia, I just want to thank you so much for your amazing contribution. I was so excited when Harlene told me about it, and it came out more beautiful than I ever imagined possible. And I just really thank you for being with us here today.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so I believe next up is Susan McDaniel, who, if you can please turn on your camera, Susan, that would be lovely. And she and her colleague, Jenny, actually kick off part 2 of the book, looking at using these ideas in medical practice, medical settings. So thank you so much for being with us here today, Susan.
It's my pleasure, and thank you for the inspiring and stimulating discussion that has happened so far. It's really fun to be here. So this chapter is written with my colleague Jenny Spees, who is at Parents Weekend with her daughter right now. So she sends her regards. And our chapter is one story of collaborative practice in 21st century healthcare. And certainly I want to acknowledge that collaborative healthcare is not the dominant practice in medicine, especially in this country. But it has grown remarkably in the past 50 years as we work to embrace healthcare as a human right. I had the very good fortune to be trained by Harry Galishan and Harlene Anderson in the late 70s. Thank you, Harlene. Then I moved or immigrated to Rochester, New York from Texas. The University of Rochester was the home of George Engel, who was an internist who proposed the biopsychosocial model of medicine, saying that biomedicine was too limited to really help people and their suffering. It's also the home of Lyman Wynn, who developed a psychoeducational family therapy approach for his patients with schizophrenia at the NIMH, and then came to Rochester. So the first part of my career and later of Jenny's overlapped with the last part of George Engel and Lyman Wynn's careers. Another great stroke of luck on my part. So both men's work was founded on general systems theory that swept the sciences early in the 20th century. And later pioneers such as George and Lyman and Harry and Harlene applied these systems ideas to the human experience. And then I was able to bring to the healthcare context in Rochester what I learned from Harry and Harlene about the complexity of human relationships, their inherent paradoxes, the importance of language, storytelling, and respect in supporting people's health and healing. So collaborative practice in the 21st century in Rochester puts the health problem in context, involves significant others, and implements a biopsychosocial approach through the collaborative work of an interprofessional team of health professionals who work together on site with the patient and family. The application of this work started in primary care in the 80s, leading to an integrated primary care clinic in 1985, and to a curriculum for primary care physicians called family-oriented primary care. The next application in the 90s brought this collaborative integrated approach to psychosocial aspects of healthcare, calling it medical family therapy. In our chapter, we illustrate this work with patients, families, and their healthcare teams dealing with infertility and with genetic testing and genetic disorders. Currently, our faculty and trainees are embedded in 8 different clinical departments to deliver comprehensive care alongside other health professionals. And then finally, we describe another application of this collaborative work, which is the Physician Communication Coaching Program developed in 2011. In this program, we use direct observation and communication coding to provide individualized teaching of collaborative, patient-centered, family-based communication to physicians.
Thank you, Susan. And thank you for your contribution, for you and Jenny. And for those of you who do not know Susan, she's being quite modest. She is really the leader and voice of medical family therapy around the world, if I may call it that, Susan.
Well, thank you, Harlene. There are many voices, but I'm very happy to be one of them. And I've been fortunate to interact with a lot of people around the world who are interested in a different kind of healthcare, and we all learn from each other.
Yeah, and it is so important. It's amazing to be here with you today. But you know what, I saw my clients yesterday, and one of them is experiencing very severe, what would be diagnosed. She's been diagnosed with OCD type symptoms. But very quickly we realized it really all started with one conversation with her physician, when he told her, that she, it's how he handled her cancer diagnosis, and her this whole experience is 18 years later, and the levels of trauma, and she really, as she actually told her story, because I'm just meeting her, the multiple physicians and how they communicated with her through this, very grueling cancer journey, is with her 18 years later. And I've had so many clients where, yes, they went through the medical difficulties, but those conversations with their physicians, the lasting trauma is really profound. And I don't know, I think your work is just so important, because going through major health struggles has got enough trauma embedded in that as
Right.
well. Conversations, and especially yesterday was funny with my client. One of the things we were just talking about is how oftentimes physicians, when they see something suspicious on a scan, they start just going down, rattling off the list of potential, diagnoses. And they're like, well, we'll do get you back to you in a week or two when we get the final results. Bye-bye. And they send you home wondering if you have 3 months left to live or there's nothing wrong whatsoever. And I don't know if you want to speak to some of that and how.
Sure.
Yeah.
That's my territory for sure. So to focus on the communication coaching program, which has really been such a great thing to learn a way to frame and package what we care about and value in a way that's acceptable and interesting to physicians. I tried a lot of other ways. They didn't go so well. But this, do you want a communication do you want a therapist or a behavioral scientist? No, my patients don't have those problems. Do you want a communication coach? Well, that sounds interesting. Anyway, so part of the coaching program is at least 4 hours of observation and coding sitting in with physicians, seeing patients. And so, since 2011, I've seen a lot. And one thing I want to say is some of these physicians are astounding. They're fantastic. They, put them up there with any of our collaborative heroes. On the other hand, there are also those that you just described. So the person who looks at the study or the X-ray or the CT scan, whatever it is. So what we would code what you said, like it could be this or this or this or this. We would code that unhelpful transparency. So there's transparency that's helpful because it takes into account the other person's values and needs, etc., versus just talking out loud about whatever your internal conversation is that relates to some course you had in medical school. So, and people really vary on their ability to monitor themselves that way and to engage in the dialogue in that way. I do think most of them really actually want to do that. I'm also on the medical school admissions committee. I have been for years. And still, the students that want to go to medical school, almost 100% want it for values we might all share. But the training and the amount that they have to learn can pound it out of them. Anyway, so I do think this is a vehicle to really encourage, and frequently, even more than therapy sessions, I have to make sure when I'm doing a debrief with a physician that I have the box of Kleenex close by, because it really returns them to why they do this work, sometimes how far they feel from it, and their desire to just be better. They want to be better human beings, and they want to do right by their patients and families. So one of the things that happens when I talk to therapists or anybody in general, I do think in our culture in the United States, at least, it's acceptable to stereotype physicians. We have a stereotype that relates to power and abuse of power and just insensitivity and basically wanting a lot of money. Like with some stereotypes, there's obviously some people that have a lot of that going on, but I just think we want to engage with them in a different kind of way. And most people want to relieve people's suffering. I think another part of this work that we have something to offer has to do with interprofessional collaboration and the fact that, patients' problems, biopsychosocial problems are complex, and no one person or one skill set often is really what the patient needs. But if you put people together who understand how to collaborate effectively with patients and families, but especially with each other, then you really have a much more powerful intervention, like with your cancer patient. So I find that very stimulating, and really trying to understand people's suffering as reflecting multiple dimensions of what it means to be human. So a lot of times in the coaching program, I see physicians do absolutely beautiful work with a patient or a patient and a family member, but using those same skills with their colleagues, nope. So the work often can really focus on trying to keep these people from stereotyping each other, it's just like the worst family session you ever saw when you put these people together. On the other hand, when they work well together, it's like listening to a beautiful symphony, Everybody has something to offer. They respect and value each other. And it's such a great experience for the patient.
Susan, your and Jenny's work is just such a gift to the entire world who is here listening. I think everyone listening to you right now is like, oh my God, I hope my doctors get into Susan's and Jenny's program. Because I think we've all had those experiences. And I just thank you for your incredible contribution, really to society. I mean, it's not just to the field. I think any of us who've gone through difficult, medical situations with our families, ourselves, our loved ones, how important this exact issue is. And so just thank you and Jenny so much for your just incredible contributions to the field, for sharing it in our book. And thank you for being with us here today.
Well, thanks for the opportunity. And I guess just one other thing, which is to encourage all of us who identify as therapists or consultants to not write this whole healthcare thing off, because it can be pretty, imposing. But if you take one person at a time and apply your exceptional skills, it can really help them and then help the people that they work with.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think what surfaces for me that's so important, Susan, is that in the physicians and other healthcare professionals, learning the importance of the patient or the client's voice is a learning for them to pay attention to their own voice.
Absolutely.
And the voice,
Absolutely.
kind of a ripple effect. So
They can feel like a cog in the wheel.
And now if we could just get you to have a little more political influence.
I'm working on it, Harlene. I'm much better than I was years ago. So age helps. And the fact that the medical center pays for this coaching program across the medical center we're in, all of the clinical departments, is kind of remarkable. So I'm very happy about that.
You should be very happy and proud, for sure. Thank you.
Incredible
Thank
work.
you all.
Thank you. Hey. And then the last chapter that we are going to highlight today is about ancestral knowledge. Rocio, Papusa, you want to go ahead and turn on your cameras? Wonderful. Hola, welcome.
Hola.
Hola.
Hello. It says that I cannot begin my video because the host. Okay, thank you.
Awesome. Beautiful. We're very excited to have both of you here today. And I know we have lots of folks around the world who are here very interested in your work with ancestral knowledge, sometimes, related to just the whole topic of Indigenous knowledge. And so I'm going to go ahead and highlight you if I can. And maybe you can tell everyone a little bit about your chapter.
Thank you. Thank you, Diana. Thank you, Harlene. First of all, for inviting us and invite us to write this chapter. It has been an adventure. And of course, Papus, if you think that I would appreciate if you would just jump in the conversation, and then I'm going to beginning. Okay. And thank you, Carla, for the translation for all our colleagues in Latin America and other places. Okay. This chapter, what we really want to do is to try to invite the readers to reflect on the ancestral knowledge and its relationship with collaborative and dialogical practices. And in the beginning, there's someone in the chat that was saying that they would like to have more concrete things that are how do we apply the collaborative and dialogical practice in the context, in the place. And here is, I think it's one of the chapters that we are doing this, because in the chapter there's consultation with the Mayan family, because we are from Yucatan, where is one of the most important cities around the world, of the Mayan world. And we have an description of consultation with a community of people around something that it seems to be infidelity, for example, that we as therapists, we work with that all the time, but it's not the same. It is just totally different. So we invite you to jump on the book and read this chapter so you could see this consultation. I think that one of the first things that we could see in this relation is the way that ancestral knowledge describe, or that our ancestors describe mental health, mental illness. This point of view of mental illness has to do with the disruption of harmony between the community, the environment, the family, and the cosmos. And it is not an individual problem. And illness that cannot be resolved between two people, the expert and the person that goes to consultation. It has to be dissolved, not resolved, but dissolved between the community, the family, the ancestrals that are in the town, the man that it's a shaman or a killer, and the man that it's part of the shaman, and all of the family and all of the community that has to do with that person. It is not just that the professional and a person, even though it is a family, it is not just them. It is all the community that has to do relations with them. Another thing is the multiple voices, because they don't hear or they don't listen just to one voice. They have to listen not just the voice of human beings. They had to listen the voice of the nature, the voice of gods, the voice of the land, and the voice of all the community. So that is a multiple voices all the time in this. And that means how does the wind had a voice? Yes, it has for them. And it's really interesting about that. And in the chapter, you can see how it is used and how do they think it is saying. One of the other things, it's of course the idea that not one person is the expert, because they relate with many things. So they hear all the voices in the conversation or in the situation that they have. Another thing is that they use, for example, and I'm going to use it first of all, the metaphor of guest and host, because for them, they are host and guest for everyone that goes to the community, and they do not decide to do anything without knowing the others and the relation that the others had with each one of them. So that's really important, and it seems for us that it's very similar of what we do in our collaborative and dialogical practices. And just to finish this part, it is like, well, for them and for us, first comes the relation, and then comes the project, because after having this relation between them, it comes the possible futures and the projects that the community would arrive at the end of a meeting or a session or whatever. So I don't know, Papus, if I'm missing something.
No, I would just add that this is an example of working in the Mayan community of Yucatan. But as we started to prepare this chapter, we look at examples of other parts around the world, like the Samis and the northern Finlands, in the northern areas of Finland and Norway and Sweden. And we look at Samoan people and how, quote unquote, the issues in the community is a collective issue. Like, for example, in the Samoans, if a man is the perpetrator of domestic violence, is other men, is the men in the community who deal with him, for example. No, so the more that we got into a deep relationship with collaborative and dialogic practices, the more that we started to see all these connections, all these threads that connect with ancestral knowledge all over the planet, not just in the Yucatan Peninsula. But as I said, we look at Samoa, we look at the northern areas of Finland, we look at the indigenous people of Canada, First Nation people, and indigenous people in the United States. We look at the indigenous people in Colombia. So the more we start studying of indigenous people practices and concepts of health in general and mental health issues, the more that we started to trace all these connections. That's all.
I would like to say I have learned so much for working with Rocio and Papusa, and they have really opened my eyes to the importance of what they are calling connections in the larger spaces in which we live and perform our everyday lives. And
Harlene, I'm going to pause you. Just turn on your camera. I can't do it for you. Zoom protects your privacy.
oh, okay. So yeah, I've just learned so much and become so aware, and I'm using it in my teaching and in my writing. Stories from indigenous cultures and the way that they think about things, the way they think about weaving a tapestry or making a bow or herding their reindeer. It's just amazing that there's just so much outside of my own, I would say, narrow Western perception of life. It's very humbling. Thank you so much for what you've offered me over the years and will continue to offer me.
Thank you, Harlene.
And what you just said, Harlene, remind me, I remember, Rocio, do you remember once we presented these ideas in Czech Republic?
Yep.
And people start saying, but who are our ancestors? And we say, we all have ancestors. Doesn't matter if you are, quote unquote, a white European person, doesn't matter. Look at the practice of your ancestors and look at the storytelling, look at the metaphors, look at what the wisdom of the ancestors. And in this time in Czech Republic, a woman started talking about saying, I am what is traditionally called a gypsy or a Roman woman. And she started talking about how they deal with issues in their community. And it was wonderful. So it's an invitation also to all of us, no matter where we are coming from, to look at the ancestor knowledge that is present.
Yeah.
And you can bring into any conversation. Reminds me a little bit of what Saliha talked about, context. You know, it's the context of what Sheila Magnami talks about, radical presence, and the meaning of the context in which the person comes from.
Absolutely. And I think this work is so incredible. And I'm realizing there are actually now two levels as we're talking. one papooses would, you know, looking at, I mean, so your article can invite folks, or your chapter, excuse me, can invite folks to reflect on their own personal ancestral knowledge. And then on the other hand, I think what you were introducing so beautifully into kind of the professional discourse is this concept of, you know, the problem within relationships and community, which to some extent family therapy has done. But I think what is so powerful that you're doing is also this, how indigenous knowledge, indigenous practices, they are connected not just to the community, but to life, spirit, you know, those who have gone before us. And it's funny, and I don't know if it's funny, but it's ironic. I have a book on mindfulness and acceptance in marriage and family therapy. And I talk about these through the Buddhist lens. There's looking at the individual, you know, level of health, relational level of health, but then just how you relate to life itself. Like, and that kind of connects back up with Harlene's philosophy. But I think at this time in history, I think just how indigenous peoples know how to actually take care of this planet. I have a lot to say there. That knowledge is so precious, but actually attending to your relationship to life, spirit, the world, as well as your community, as well as yourself. It invites this third level that we have not talked a lot about. And it's a time in history where I think we need to be talking more about that. And we just have a couple minutes, but maybe you want to just comment on some of that.
I just want to say, for example, for them, when they have an illness, it can be mental or whatever, they invite everyone. And in that point, they, if the gods are not there, the spirits are not there, the land, the community, and all the people that had related with them, they cannot be finished with the illness. They have to feel everyone in the room or in the state that everything is like alineado, papus.
Align.
Align everything. But if it's not, you're not ready. And everybody just working all together to make it possible. And they said, okay, now the spirits, God, the land, and all of you, we are fine. And then it finished the illness.
Yeah. And that alignment,
wind,
that
the
heart.
wind, for example,
Mhm.
and sometimes the wind change and it seems like it happens because for them it happens and then it's fine.
Yeah. That is,
Well,
that
my
is.
mind is going back to Saliha's chapter and the influence of a particular Aboriginal artist in Australia has had on me. His name is Michael Williams, and he talks about, we don't need your map. We don't need your expertise because we have it.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And I know that
So
go ahead.
somebody comment on the chat that this is another way to call this is decolonizing psychotherapy. And yes, there's a whole discourse on decolonial work, but it still centers in colonial and the colony and the colonizer. And that's why we don't call it that way. We'd rather call it ancestral knowledge, because that center, the ancestors, that centers, as Harlene said, this man in Australia told her, they know, and we just need to center in that knowledge and really come from the not knowing position. Because to talk about decolonizing is still centered in the colonial process. So we walk away a little bit of that language.
Yes,
To me,
yes.
it's thinking about going back to mindset, how you have a different mindset, a different way of thinking about and viewing the world and your place in it and the place in relationships with other people. So Diane, wow.
Wow.
I'm
And I
so
just want to just
energized.
underscore, Papusa, it's just amazing to be having this conversation with you, because I have seen this same problem. Because, I can see where when they talk about decolonizing, it's naming some stuff, but it's very early phase, because if that's where you keep the conversation, you're still defining everything through the lens of the colonizers. So you have to move, kind of pulling back into some of what Saliha was talking about today, move into language that is native. It is the local discourse and language. And so I so appreciate what you're saying, because I think that is so important for people who work in this area to use, ancestral knowledge and indigenous terms and language. But your work is just so beautiful. I am connected with a lot of folks in Hawaii, aloha out there, and I know they are very excited about this chapter and your work. And I think there are lots of people all over the world who are just going to really benefit from what you've put out there. And I even think all of us who, even if your clients you may not be working specifically with folks who identify as being from an indigenous culture, I think the wisdom and knowledge that Rocio and Papusa, are highlighting in terms of ancestral knowledge, in terms of how we relate to the land, the wind, the gods, the spirits, life, the health of the planet. I think everyone now, that is an important thing for all of us to be considering, how we walk this earth in harmony. And I love that theme that comes out of mental health in your work. Thank you so much for your amazing contribution to this book. And at this point, we're going to put a pause on this chapter and kind of open the whole thing up for questions from the audience. And I know many of you have put questions into the chat over the last 2 hours, but I'm going to ask if you want them answered by any of the authors that you can either repost. We have my assistant, it's actually my niece is assisting us on all the technical issues. That's the Audrey Gehart you see there. But yeah, maybe invite back all of the chapter authors who spoke today, if you want to turn on your cameras, and we will just go ahead and take the questions. Okay. Oh, when is the book coming out?
Thank you for creating a space for other voices.
Absolutely.
I'm curious about some of the inner voices, as some of us have been privileged to be able to speak out loud.
And before I forget, I want to thank our translators. We have so many things going on here, but I definitely want to thank Carla is translating for us. I think she's actually in Poland. She's doing our Spanish channel. And then our translators from China include Yang and Sherry, who have been taking turns doing the Chinese translation. Again, we apologize for those of us who spoke too fast, but thank you both for your incredible contributions to this international event. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and, someone asked, when's the book coming out? Janet, hi Janet. Well, I actually looked on Amazon this morning, and Amazon says it's in stock. And neither Harlene nor myself have gotten a copy, but if you pre-ordered it on Amazon, you probably have it before we do, because somehow Amazon customers get it before the authors, is what I have learned. Okay.
I'll order one from Amazon.
I know, seriously. How can we watch the recordings? They will be on the abstracts. They will all be on my YouTube channel. Everyone who registered, we will email you a link. We're actually trying to get a copy. I've never done this before. The Spanish translation. We'll find out if I successfully did it. And I know the folks in China are making it available there as well. Okay. Yeah, I see one. Let's see. Oh, I have one for Sally. Oh God, this is coming in so quick. Okay. Can you all bring in how in the moment power, meaning, sharing and creating shares with Gestalt therapy, including mutuality is ongoingly constructed? I don't know, Sally, how would you like to respond to that?
Can you just read that again, Pam?
I guess someone's asking how the in the moment power and meaning making. I don't know if you can speak to Gestalt, which is a very experiential approach, and maybe just connecting it with some experiential approaches.
Well, I did train in Gestalt a long time back when I was at Virginia Tech. So
I didn't think you could take this question. You can.
I think there are so many answers. I think each of us here would give a different answer. But that said, again, I think about it as our theories. And this is why it's so important what Harlene writes in the first few chapters. She doesn't call it a theory. It's a way of being and a philosophical stance, because those philosophical stance can underpin some other ideas and they percolate as theories, right? So absolutely some of these ideas around meaning making and language will show up in other ways of thinking and making sense. So that's how I understand that question. That said, all theories, as Lynn Hoffman will say, they're maps, they're guideposts. They're not the realities. The map is not the territory.
Mm-hmm.
That I say that to say that what we're talking about today is how we construct knowledge and whose knowledge matters.
Mm-hmm.
And so do we privilege the client's knowledge of that experience if you're doing Gestalt work, or are you going to privilege your theory as you interpret it, not even what the author, as you interpret it? So I could go on. I'll pause as food for thought. What do you think?
We have a question coming in from YouTube, and I'll see if anyone wants to take it. How do you deal with non-cooperative clients like oppositional defiant disorder? Mostly child cases, it seems like this, but someone would like to respond to that.
I'll start.
Okay.
I think it's first, how can you shake the idea of oppositional behavior disorder? How can you let that float around? Let that cloud go? Because that connects with what I was talking about earlier about generalizations, where it's very easy to place people into categories or to think in terms of problems as types and kinds of problems. And that begins to narrow your vision. It begins to narrow how you can see and hear and interact, experience the other person. And we're much more apt to respond in ways that encourage those descriptions and those feelings that we place on another person. So I always think myself, if I'm working with someone and there's some kind of unhelpful thought that creeps in, I'm thinking, okay, Harlene, what can you do? What can I do to change the way I'm thinking about or experiencing this person? I can't change another person. The only person in the room I can change is myself.
Mm-hmm.
So if I'm feeling frustrated or stuck, okay, I need to start with me. How am I contributing to this so-called behavior or resistance, or whatever we might want to call it?
Yeah, exactly. And I think, and this maybe ties into, there's some other questions I'm reading in there. So I think when someone comes in, if they're whatever oppositional, I just be curious, go enter their holodeck, understand how they're making meanings. Why do they not want to follow whatever an authority figure is telling them to do? And where does this idea come from? And how does it work in their life? Just be curious and understand. And it just takes you on a whole journey. There is a whole series of meanings behind that. and I just follow it, and I'm curious. Just in terms of where it leads. There is always a whole breadcrumb trail you need to follow. And as you do that, you're discovering it, but they often are too. And I would say, especially with my adolescents, when I get curious about where these ideas come from, they are, just as curious as I am. And as we it's like a mystery sometimes that we're putting it together. And I have someone here who's asking, what if you attempt to have your client find their own meaning, but they don't allow themselves to? How do you remain curious with that sort of self-sabotaging behavior? Well, I just get curious, So where did this meaning come from? Whatever that I don't know, someone's judging or trying to control you, whatever it might be. And if they say, I don't know, and sometimes they do, that's going back to Susan, I just let there be a pause. And I let there be silence, and I let them think about it. And so we sit there and we sit together and we pause, and sometimes they struggle. And then sometimes, in that case, I typically will do well, there's this pot. What about this thread we could follow, or that, something your mother said, your friend said, your this said, could it be anything like this? And we just start looking and exploring together. Because sometimes they don't always have a conscious awareness, but we go on this exploration of where this meaning came from, and together we discover it on this journey side by side. And I'm still blindfolded. They're not quite sure where they're going. They're going to a corner of the holodeck they've never seen before, but we're going together, and I let them take me on the journey. There's always a breadcrumb trail of meaning. It's always there. And sometimes it looks like the breadcrumbs have disappeared, and then you pause, you reflect, you sit with it. And then you look at, which way is the wind blowing? I'm going to use the wind metaphor. What is the land speaking? What is your, what kind of, where do we go from here? What are we seeing here? And we just pick up the next thread and we see if it takes us someplace. Not every thread takes you someplace, and that's okay. And we're all learning together to map it out together, if that answers both of those questions.
I may add to that. I think by expanding the metaphor, like thinking differently, I would say also to reflect, where does the metaphor of self-sabotage come from? I'm back to think of the relational loop, that is our language. Is that the client's language? And I think it is part of the mental health discourse of how we understand people's presentations and their experiences. And I think Rocio and Papuza's chapter invite us into thinking, what other framings can we bring in? What and whose meanings are we bringing to understand someone's behavior, whether it's resistance or self-sabotage? So just, again, to continue reflecting on our own education.
Yes. Yeah. And thank you because I think the language, self-sabotage or resistance, when you work in this way, it's kind of meaningless, because, it's just there is a whole breadcrumb trail behind what someone might call self-sabotage. There is a whole very logical string of meanings and experiences that have happened. And I don't see it as self-sabotage. I just see it as a series of meanings, because everyone's behavior makes sense, in context. And so there's a whole reason for self-sabotage. And so it's just a series that we explore. Someone else is asking, and would it be fair to say the collaborative dialogic practice includes allowing clients artistic choices in their holodeck to influence and inspire new artistic choices in their own holodeck? Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And there are these moments when you're talking with clients, and you can see them going, is that the breadcrumb trail that makes me do this? And they're like, I don't want to keep doing that. And they're able to kind of redecorate their holodeck, so to speak, redesign it, draw new connections. Sometimes it can happen very consciously, and sometimes it's a slower process, and it happens over multiple conversations in slow ways. So I think I answered a couple, but I'll let a few more folks respond. And then I will just say, Susan, people are asking for your references and where to read more about what you're doing. So if you get a chance, Susan, if you could pop those in the chat.
Right, I did respond to that. I think the references in the chapter are a good place to start. I could try to put them in the chat, although I think that would be lengthy. I put my email in the chat, so anybody be very welcome to write me. Do you have any other suggestions, Diane?
Hey, you know, if you're okay, I can post them. I can post them on the webpage.
Great, thank
How
you.
about
Yeah.
Yep.
And also a link to Susan's webpage.
That'd be great.
And Saliha mentioned language, and I would like to interject here that the word meaning, the notion of meaning, is our language. That may not be the client's language. Their language may be understanding, or how does one understand this? Help me understand this. It may be logic. You know, we have different logic maps that we work from. So keep in mind that meaning is a word that we're using that encompasses a lot.
There's a question here from Stephanie. Says, I'm curious how we work with clients from the place of curiosity when their response is, I don't know. And I often say, join into their not knowing.
Yes.
I think this is where, again, that person was talking about creative artistic expression. How might we receive I don't know, not as a literal, and it can be literal, but also as an artistic expression, as a creative expression of what knowing is and supposed to be in this moment.
And-
So I sometimes come back to it by saying, well, let's explore that about not knowing. Sorry, Rocio, go ahead.
No, that was what I was going to say. How to open the possibilities of a word, of what does that word means, and how it touched you, or in what other moments you don't know and what had happened. But to try always to open possibilities, and to not just thinking in a literally, I don't know, because that stops you to continue the conversation. So how to open all of these ideas, and what you were saying at the beginning, maybe it was you, or I don't know. I know, yeah, it was, the word is a territory that is shared, and it's from the one that talks and the one from listening. And that was John Shutter said. So let's talk about that word.
Mhm. Mhm.
And related to this, someone is asking, so how does joining in the holodeck facilitate change? And I guess we have not made that perfectly clear. Well, and I guess we could all maybe try to describe it. And I will just start by saying, as you are co-exploring, I call it the client's meaning-making system, and the meanings that they're making, they are also, as we ask them questions, they understand their holodeck, for lack of a better metaphor there, in new ways. They see it in new ways. And what is so powerful about this approach, in my mind, is that it is the client understanding their own meaning-making system, rather than me introducing a foreign idea or concept from, therapeutic literature and asking them to adopt it. And so it's totally organic to their meaning-making system, and they are making new connections. They are seeing their world in different ways, and they're seeing it's almost like they see their world from a different angle. And it's like when you change the angle, you see something different, and that is how the possibilities open up. But it's always from within the client's worldview. It's not me taking an outside idea and trying to convince them, try this, try this idea on, try this practice. It's the change is coming from within their meaning-making system. And so they're the ones who see the new possibilities. And then taking action is much easier for them because it makes sense within their worldview, compared to, let's say you're doing a, psychodynamic or, cognitive, and you're refuting some kind of irrational thought. the client can leave and go, I don't believe that. And when you work this way, and we've come up with new ways of viewing things together, they can't unsee their world from this perspective. That's the best way I can try to explain how change happens. I don't know if anyone else would love to expand or add or even offer another way to describe that.
I think, Diane, it's important to keep in mind having an agenda to change another person's perspective. That it has to do, I think, with, and I know you have this, the trust in the dialogical and the conversational process, the relational process. It comes in the doing with each other.
Mm-hmm.
And it sometimes can come, and it sometimes can take a long time, and you never want to, I think I would never want to hold on to an idea of what it should look like, what the change should look like.
And
You're just inspiring me to think about these things. I'm not saying this directly to you.
No, but that's so important, because I almost forgot, because I think one of the things when you start working this way, it's kind of terrifying, because you're the therapist and you're charged with making change. But when you're having this conversation and you're blindfolded, you really don't know how change is going to happen. And it's very scary. And there's this blind trust in that two-way dialogue will create new meanings that are helpful. And you're blinded in that way too, in that you don't know what the change is going to be. You have no idea. And you just know that this humanizing conversation is going to, call forth both of our sense of humanity and take us to a better place, but you really don't know how, where, or when. I remember thinking of this now, and it's scary sometimes. You'll sit down like, I have no idea how I'm going to help this person. I have that thought a lot.
Or how this is going to influence me. Yes.
Yeah, I have no idea what I'm going to do. I don't know where we're going.
Well, I think that's why I love, Harlene, your work, because it really invites us to lean into uncertainty. Right. And for me, I think our world trains us out of uncertainty by giving us change theories, by telling us what to do. And when clients come to us, some of them are coming from that tradition, while others are coming from this tradition of wanting to explore. And so I think back to change, what is change? And that it falls back into dialogue around exploring that. And it's a very hard concept to hold when we have our preconceived ideas of what change should be given their story. And I think that piece is where I find myself changing, is by leaning into uncertainty. I don't know who I'm going to arrive as, and have I helped? And just a quick story of a email that arrived literally last night. I thought it was in preparation for this. I've seen this couple maybe before the pandemic, 2-3 years back, and they just disappeared. Like I followed up, but the sessions felt rich, very rich. And I got an email last night saying, thank you for saving our marriage and our relationship. Here is a picture of our 1-year-old, and can I refer to you another client? And I was like, oh, okay. But that's the other piece, that we as human beings on the other side also get, we don't know what the process and the journey is, and we learn with them, but also we need their relational responsiveness to be seen and heard as that we are on the path with them, which is really hard in this work. So you look like,
yeah, and also what I was thinking is you have to trust in the process, and to trust in the process, it means you have to trust your client.
And yourself.
And yourself. And that many times with workshops with Harlene, I was just very anxious of saying, what is Harlene going to do? What is Harlene? And she said, I'm not going to do anything. Let's trust in the process, because I'm trusting in my client and in me. So I think that if we trust in our client and what we are doing in our philosophical stance of what we're doing, the process, it's going to develop itself, and you never know what is going to happen. You always be surprised of what is happening and what is going to happen. And sometimes we never know.
There was one question about politics. How do you use these ideas in talking with people about politically sensitive issues and differences? And that is a really, really big one. We should do a whole book on that.
Yes.
That's a very important question today, particularly.
Yeah, and I would say just be curious.
Mhm.
Someone has, in terms of, there's a lot of political divisiveness in many countries around the world. United States has it on full display, I think, and
And steroids.
steroids. But I actually I invite each one of you to consider, find someone who thinks about politics or some other worldview in a very different way than you do, and just be curious and ask questions and understand. And this has been one of my practices during this divisive time in history, to really listen to people who see what is unfolding in this country from totally different perspective, and become curious. And I promise you, if you listen and follow that breadcrumb trail of meaning, you will humanize both you and the other person. And I think it's very healing for all of us at this time. And to very much what I see often that breaks my heart is this dehumanizing discourses that are really polarizing us. And it's so easy to lose sight in these polarized conversations of the other's humanity. And I think that's one of the real special things about this work.
And I think, Diane, and being curious about a difference ends up, if you can be genuinely curious,
Yes.
with the other person experiencing you differently.
Yes.
Or experiencing me.
Yes.
The other thing that I might add, I don't know, Harlene, are you talking? I'm not able to hear you. Sorry, I see your lip moving.
No, it's okay. I should speak toward my microphone. I have two computers here, so okay.
So,
Go ahead.
You thought you were saying, it looked like you were saying something more.
Well, I was just saying that when you are curious and genuinely curious, the other person begins to experience you differently. And again, when we say different or change, it's not like, doesn't have to be immediate for any of the conversational partners. But go ahead. You wanted to say something?
I was going to add to it, because when you said to politics and then you spoke about curiosity, I think I don't want to reduce collaborative dialogic practice to curiosity only. I think Susan's chapter and her journey speaks to this idea of making, right? It's still curiosity and engagement with the other we make. And that I hope that's one of the things the readers from my chapter will take away, that you have to engage with curiosity to make. To be responsive in the world is to make with others, together, finding, co-creating that preferred reality that doesn't exist, right? So if there is something that I have learned from all of this, is this idea of engaging with people to say, how do we want to respond? And in that response, what I'm creating an inclusive pedagogy program for certification of our faculty. It's out of the blue, but I'm not making it myself. I'm making it with our faculty in conversation. And so that's the other piece that I think that curiosity is generative. And what it evokes in us to act on that generative process and create that which is not there. So I would say that's one of the things when I was reading your chapter, Susan, I was taking away is just the history was beautiful to read how it comes about, and it's inspirational in that way, right?
Thanks, Saliha. it does all evolve, and presenting a different approach to interacting with people. I think first people are very skeptical, but when we persist, then it's often hard to get them to stop wanting us to coach them. But we have many people that need it. We need a population health approach to coaching. So, but it's what they, it's what they like. And we benefit from low expectations in the beginning,
Oh,
which I really love. Like, go ahead, expect nothing.
yeah, how could this lead to something? And I think sometimes when people are new to this work, that's often the perspective, in both in medical as well as in the mental health field. It doesn't seem, how could this create much change? I think it's hard to understand how it unfolds, but there's a real creative process like Saliha was discussing, where things really happen. And they're things that are in harmony, to use Erosio and Papusa's term, in harmony with how the person already sees with their values, in harmony with their worldview. And it is such an important thing that we do. And, I just want to tag on one other thing, just related to my example of, listening to someone whose opinion is very different than your own. Many of the people I talk to, we probably will still continue voting differently. But I have rehumanized them. I see them differently. I'm telling you, it reduces my stress level. And it makes me have hope for humanity and hope for the world. And so these conversations aren't necessarily magical solutions. I will say sometimes they really are, but they're not always magical solutions. But what they do is allow everyone to reconnect with that human part of themselves and everyone else. And it creates hope, which I think is just so important at this time in history. We need to wrap up here. I don't know, Harlene, do you want to, or anyone else want to chime in as we log off?
No, I was looking at the time myself. I'm so appreciative of our chapter authors who agreed to join us today. And I'm really looking forward to next Saturday. And we need more time. But I so appreciate people who have joined us. It's heartwarming, it's encouraging to see interest in what we're doing and to be able to share it. So thank you, everyone. And thank you, Diane, for going on this journey with me, and each and every one of you. And so nice to see people that I've known over the years on the screen and in the list of participants. And it's also very nice to see names of people that I haven't met and I hope to meet one day.
Yes, and thank you all for joining us today. There will be a recording of this available openly on YouTube. I will email everyone when it is available. And again, as a reminder for those who've signed up for the continuing education, that will become available after the next webinar it has launched, and you'll get email instructions related to that. And again, thank you to our probably not tireless, I'm guessing they're pretty tired, our two interpreters, who or three interpreters, excuse me, to Carla for Spanish and Young and Sherry for Chinese. We thank you so much for making this available worldwide. And I hope all of you can come back next Saturday. We will begin, which at 8 Pacific, 11 Eastern, and continue moving through this work that showcases collaborative dialogic practices across contexts and cultures. Until then, everyone, be well, take care. We look forward to seeing you again next week.
And enjoy the rest of your weekend. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.